Howdy everybody, I'm Nathan Donnelly. This is Northwest Resilience channel, and already the smoke is being funny with us. I wanted to do a video on episode 10 of Alone season 6, of which I was a participant. Man, that was a heavy thing to watch. I just watched it this morning. It aired last night. And then I watched it a second time to take some notes for this video, and I tell you, it left me a little bit like in a funk, I guess you could say. That was a really hard time. Started out, I think sometime around day 55 is where they left us off last week, and things started to get hairy right around day 55. A couple days after that, the cold, it had already been cold, the cold really switched on, the lake really froze over, and things started to get Arctic. And at that point, there's only 4 of us left, and I'm going to try and pick up where the show picks up and kind of give my as detailed an insider point of view on this as I can give, as somebody who was out there. There's a lot that doesn't make it into the show because they have an incredible amount of material coming from us. I know I for one just basically kept my cameras rolling at all times, and that's actually something to talk about that late in the game, much beyond like 30 or 40 days, or once the weather started to hover well below freezing all the time. The batteries in most of our cameras didn't work anymore. The GoPros were the first to go. They really were worthless, much below freezing at all for us. And we had a JVC, a really actually pretty cool little hand-sized JVC video camera that you could adjust the focus with your 2 fingers here and turn it on and off real easy. It was waterproof, it was shockproof, it was a sweet little camera. It was small enough to fit in a large pocket. That thing started to give out shortly after the GoPros, and we were stuck carrying around a camera that was about yay big, with a microphone mounted on top of it, and our lav mic, our wearable mic, was attached to it, and then attached to us, and then it was attached to a big old tripod because there was no other way to use the thing. And it was a chunky mess of something you didn't want to have to carry around while you're trying to survive. So we were down to our 1 camera, and then there was the 2 game cameras on the trees that I think continue to work pretty well in the cold. They were always put fresh lithium-ion Energizer batteries in them, and my wind is changing here this morning. I wonder if we have some weather coming, but I'm gonna move aside a little bit. So that's something that is one of the things that doesn't really make it into the edit of the show. So I'm gonna just kind of carry on with what I just watched and took notes on, and let you know what my own mental process is as somebody who was out there, and as somebody who spent years before getting out there preparing to make myself into a serious contender for Alone, to get on the show, and then to win it. So I had some buy-in into that whole process, particularly once I was accepted onto the show, and your mental state becomes pretty acute about stuff like that. So I want to share some of that stuff because I'm on the forums. I got on Facebook after this whole thing happened, just to keep abreast of the situation, and otherwise I'm not on social media. I hadn't been on. I'm on Instagram now as well. You can follow me at Northwest Resilience, Northwest.Resilience on Instagram, and I read the comments that people have, and it's a lot of kind of like, not thought through. Give it 2 or 3 seconds before you respond to think about whether or not what you're saying makes sense even to somebody who hasn't been out there. And so I wanted to address some of that stuff from the opposite end of the spectrum, somebody who has had the opportunity to overthink every little thing about it. So we pick up, it says day 58. I believe we left off at day 54 or 55 last episode, and it starts up day 58 right off the bat. So there's already a 3-day chunk in there that we don't get to see. And when we're giving them 40 hours of footage a week each, and then they have to turn that into a 40-minute episode, there's a lot you're not going to see, and it's got to be a really hard job for production, and then production's got its own weird, priorities about what kind of drama it wants to shoot and what kind of, what angle of its own ass they want to cover and all that stuff. So starts out day 58. There's 4 of us remaining: Woniya, Barry, Jordan, and myself. Starts out with Woniya remarking on how short the days are. It's 3 in the afternoon. She's outside of her shelter, and already the sun is going down. And they cut to another video or another shot of it was something like 4:15 in the afternoon, and it's already getting dark. The sun travels at an angle like this, like it raises like this and goes down like that. So on the equator, the sun goes like this, and once the sun goes behind the horizon, it's black. It's dark in 20 minutes. Up there, the sun is just skimming below the surface, and it's throwing light over the horizon for quite a while before it's gone. So sunrise and sunset isn't all of our daylight hours, but we'll get another hour out of either side of that. But it's still up, in the I think on the winter solstice, it's only up for 19 and a half hours a day or something like that. So yeah, it's getting cold, it's getting serious, and the next scene cuts to me trying to do something about it in my shelter. I mentioned in earlier videos, I built a really big shelter partially so I could build a secondary, smaller shelter inside of the first one near to my fire. And I did a raised bed platform. I did a roof over it. The back wall was shared with the back wall of the shelter, which I doubled up super thick, 2 feet in spruce boughs. And then on the interior of the shelter, which was all ribs, I actually wove shingles of birch bark through the spruce to keep any wind from being able to penetrate that wall, because it was. The wind can blow pretty fiercely out there. And then on the other side, the side that I entered from, I had the fire going. I built a fire ring out of stones that one face was up against the fire, and then the stone would continue underneath the raised platform of my bed. So I had one stone in there that was about that big, probably weighed 80 or 90 pounds, and that was the main back facing of the fire, with 2 or 3 others that were doing a similar thing. And then I put a face of green logs against my shelter, and then I put more stone in front of those green logs to protect them from the flame. And with the idea being that if I had that fire as close as possible to my bed and those stones underneath my bed being heated, then they would potentially release heat through the night. To what extent that actually happened is really hard to say, because it was freaking cold regardless. I ended up there's kind of a little doorway about this big underneath my entryway to the bed, which is just to the left of the fire if you see it on video, on the show. And I kind of came up with a system where I dug a little channel out from underneath there and put a couple of green sticks under there, and I was heating rocks on the fire for close to an hour, till in some cases they were literally glowing red. And then I was putting those onto those 2 sticks so I could slide them underneath my bed, have them elevated up off of the moss a little bit, which potentially could singe and start to smolder, and then release that heat up into my torso, my body, where I was sleeping. And there was 2 or 3 nights where I did actually feel that heat. My mattress was about that thick of really compressed moss, lichen, soil, and then later on I found a good supply of sedges, and I started making a thick bed of sedges. And again, only on like 2 or 3 occasions could I literally feel that heat, but I'm sure it brought the ambient temperature up an amount that was helpful. I had really severe problems with my sleeping bag being warm enough, um, and that was hard. That was one of the hardest things, to go to bed at night and know that for the next 16 hours you are just there to try and keep yourself warm and to try and keep the soles of my feet from going numb, or halfway up my leg, which is pretty much most nights. One or both of my feet were going numb on me, and that was hard to do. Somewhere around the opening of season 10 is when the very coldest night that we had out there occurred, and for whatever reason they're only showing whatever the low temperature or whatever the temperature at whatever time in the afternoon we happen to be talking is, which is practically the daytime high, and it's in the single digits Fahrenheit. At night it was getting well into the teens, and I believe to over 30 below on one particular night. That one night was freakishly cold, and I was, again, going to my bed. I remember I had my glove off for one reason, just long enough to pull the shoulder of my sleeping bag up over me like a blanket and zip it up, and I remember touching the taffeta on my sleeping bag and feeling like I could get contact frostbite from it, like it was made of dry ice. It was very cold, and I was genuinely concerned that my tarp might shatter in the night. There's some good footage of Barry being inside of his shelter, and it is just encrusted with ice on the inside. I had the same thing going on in my shelter, and when you did finally get a warm afternoon and a fire going simultaneously, you could melt that stuff off, and then it would drip all this smoky creosote water down onto all your stuff, and then that would get covered in ice and freeze immediately. It was a very interesting environment. So that was my rock system. I would put those rocks underneath there, and then I had a bunch of sedges or other rocks or whatever, and I'd plug that hole, and I had my bed sealed all the way around so that the heat wouldn't just dissipate out the sides. It would have to hopefully rise up through my mattress and try to keep me warm. That said, I called my bed my incubator, by the way, because I did spend so much time in there. I did a lot of thinking. It was a very productive place for me to be, actually, because I just had ideas like that, and I could design a trap. I could figure out even problems back at home that I needed to fix, and just do it almost immediately. Stuff that I'd think about for weeks and not have it come up with a good idea, I'd just solve immediately. So it was a place I went to stay warm and hatch ideas, so I called it my incubator. The top of the incubator I made as a shelf because I wanted more storage area, and that's where I kept my Pelican boxes. We had one gargantuan Pelican box for all the camera equipment, and one smaller but still large one that had our recharging devices in it, and kept all our batteries and camera and smaller camera stuff in there. So I put those on the top for a roof, hoping they would add some extra insulation, and then the rest of it I buried in more moss and whatever kind of insulative material I could get my hands on. The foot of the bed, I did a curtain of sedges that I kind of wove out of it. The head of the bed right next to me, I hung my shemagh down just as a curtain to keep air from blowing through. That helped a good bit. And I draped that whole shelter as best I could in material. As thick as my mattress was, though, that material would pack out every single night, and I'd have to go out and refluff it up every single night. And it was about 10 or 30 minutes of preparing the bed, aside from the sleeping bag, to go and sleep in it. And even with that, both of my hips and my tailbone, after I lost all my body fat, was just raw. I felt pretty early on I got what I thought was going to be bed sores when I'd look at it, but when I looked, there'd be nothing there. There might be a bruise or something, but I didn't actually have an open sore, but it felt like I did, and you couldn't stay on one side for more than about 20 minutes. The other aspect of that is that's around the time that I decided I needed to keep a fire going 24/7 in order to keep me warm at night and survive the night. And what I had been doing is getting a pretty good fire going, keeping it going through the day. Not much bigger than this little thing right next to me here. I almost never had a fire going bigger than this right here. Just little 3-inch flames, you know. Um, but at night I would get it going. I'd get several logs burning well, and then I would bury them in wood ashes, which I had been collecting since the day I got there, and snuffing it out like 90 to 95%, so that just enough oxygen would keep in there to keep red embers alive. And that would typically work. You really had to select your logs just right so that they would be something that would smolder, which is very difficult to do. There was a lot of inconsistency in the wood materials, and yeah, you just really had to be meticulous about all those little things. So then I'd bury the fire, go to sleep, and 7 times out of 8 I'd wake up and there would still be embers for me to rebuild the fire from. That 8th time it didn't, I had to break out my bow drill kit and get it going again. So that's around the times like I need to keep genuine flame going through the night. So I was doing a push log style fire, which is where you take a log this long, maybe even longer, and you put them all together at the ends, and you build your fire at the end of those logs. And then instead of chopping them all down to stove length like these guys, you just push the logs into the fire. And it saves a lot of energy of bucking everything down to stove length. I didn't have a saw with me. I brought only an axe, and I do that now. As a camper, I will use push logs instead of stove length logs because I'm not cooking in a stove. So I would have to get up every 30-40 minutes and reach out of my shelter, lift the curtain, reach out, grab a log, and then try to push it in. And I could pretty much do that from my sleeping bag. And eventually the whole log would burn up, and I'd have to reach over to my wood pile, which I had stored, I think I had the previous evening to put good logs there, and then put that on there and do all that from within my sleeping bag and from within my incubator. And you had to put yourself on a mental clock to wake up every 30 or 40 minutes, or else I'm not putting my fire to sleep, which means it just burns out. If I miss it, it's out. And that means I have to either A, get up and do a bow drill in the middle of the night, which isn't happening, or B, I have to do it in the morning, which is time consuming and exhausted with the materials we had there. So so that was a really interesting thing. I'm staying in bed maybe as many as 16 hours a day at the very most, and I'm having to wake up every 30 or 40 minutes. It was a really wild sleep schedule. And I have to say, I don't feel like it was terribly unhealthy. It was just weird. I think it was, I think pregnant mothers can probably relate to having to wake up constantly. Not pregnant mothers, but new mothers can probably relate to constantly having to get up and care for their child. We moved to Jordan next. Temperature says it's only 7 degrees Fahrenheit, and Jordan throws some wisdom out there about needing to be on your game all the time. And if you have a minor issue happening, it can kill you. That can lead to your death, is what he says. It reminded me, which is absolutely true, there's no margin of error up there. You need to make sure certain things are happening. If they don't happen, you are going to die, or you're going to need to be rescued. It reminds me a little bit of like high altitude alpine mountaineering, which I used to do a bit of, and hopefully will again. If you have a minor problem this is more bodily, if you've got a cold or a sunburn or anything you can think of, and then you go up to high altitude, it gets magnified. It goes from a minor thing to a big thing. And the same thing up there. Anything that's a small thing here becomes a huge thing up there. In addition to the fact that you're low on body fat, you didn't eat a meal that morning, which is digesting in your body and producing heat just from the chemical process of that, and the biological process of that. You're already so near the edge bodily, and then the environment is so near the edge physically. Everything's on a knife's edge, and And he's been in that situation before and realized that he speaks to it a little bit very well, I thought. We cut to Barry next, and Barry describes the Arctic winter as a lead blanket. I could not have said it any better. It was like, that was perfectly well said. It's something you can't get out from underneath of. It's cold and it's heavy. It just really well put, Barry. He is doing sit-ups in his bed. He's doing crunches in his sleeping bag in order to generate body heat. And I was doing something similar. I did do crunches sometimes, but one of the things that I would do is I would actually flex my muscles in my body rhythmically. One of the problems with doing something like crunches in a sleeping bag, or if you're doing jumping jacks, if you're wearing clothing and you're getting cold and you want to generate some heat, is you're moving your clothes and you're turning it into a bellows. So you are forcing the warm air that is already in your clothing out. And another tactic that you can do if you find yourself in a situation where you need to warm up and use body muscle to do it is to find a stationary object like a tree and push against it hard. Use your strength to push against something, but you're not moving your body out and you're not blowing off that body heat. I was doing that in my sleeping bag by clenching my calf muscles, clenching my butt muscles, clenching my leg muscles. I was doing my legs a lot because it was my feet that were cold. My torso actually stayed pretty well warm. But I needed to force blood into my lower extremities, and I figured that if I was clenching the muscles in my legs, it might also act as a pump to get blood down there further. I can't say that I ever did like bring a foot back from being numb. There might have been like one time early on where I did, but for the most part, if my feet were cold going into the night, I had to do something about it by getting out of the bag and warming up near the fire. And at one point, I had to get up at 2 a.m., get the fire going again, and warm my feet by it. It was, it's to crawl in and realize, oh crap, I'm gonna be like this for the next 10, 12, 16 hours. It takes some mental fortitude, and you had better have something good up there to think about, to endure it over and over and over again. Let's see. Wonia is out getting water again. They cut to Wonia, and she's chopping a hole in the ice, and she has some kind of a tool that she made that I never got a good look at, and I would really like to see what she did. But she was chopping through the ice with like a mini spud. It looked about that long, and I don't know what she had on the end of that for a bit. I actually found a few old nails, or spikes actually, that I was able to, they were old steel spikes, and I was able to grind a pretty pointy edge on one of them and then heat it in my fire and then quench it in snow so that it would stay hard. I never did figure out a good way to mount it on a pole so that I could use it for something to break ice, but it was more of an ice pick, and my axe I thought was just a lot more efficient at doing that work anyway. So I still have that at home somewhere, but I'll go into the work I did doing some blacksmithing on the show after the season is done airing, because I made some cool stuff. Let's see here. That's about the time they cut to me, and I have just gotten back from my fish trap, my fish net, and unfortunately I made the call that I had to pull it. That one night it got so cold so fast that the ice moved, I bet 300 or 400 yards in one night, and just like that, I thought I had maybe a week or two left of free water before my net was going to be needing to get pulled because the ice was coming to encrust it. But I came out there, and sure enough, it was there all of a sudden. I had good feelings that morning about going and finding a fish in my net, and instead what I found was ice. And it was really hard to take apart that whole system that I designed and roll it up and put it in my backpack.